Let me just mention the similarities between the 30s and now. We have very strong right-wing parties in Europe. We have economic crisis. We have in Russia, we have aggressive European power. We have strong lessening of belief in democracy. Should we be worried?
Well, I would say that we should certainly be worried, but we should be not panic-stricken in the short term, partly because panic in the short term may actually help prevent us thinking more deeply about the longer-term problems. And I think, if you look at the contrast with the 1930s, there are also, there are the similarities that you mentioned, but those also embody some very deep differences. One is, obviously, that the economic crisis is not nearly so deep. In Germany, I imagine in Austria too, by 1932, more than 25% of the working population was unemployed.
Yes.
Same was true in the United States, by the way. Today, obviously, youth unemployment is very high, but the overall figures are much less than that. And, of course, this is also cushioned by the welfare state to a considerably greater degree than in the 1930s. So the economic crisis is not so deep. I would compare it rather to what used to be called the Great Depression, which started here in Vienna in 1873, which was much more like a generation of readjustment with deep suffering for certain sectors, especially the agricultural sector, growth in others, and so forth. But a second, of course, critical difference is that the generation that made fascism, Nazism, and, by the way, communism as well in Europe in the 1930s, was a generation that had gone through the First World War. Hitler, Mussolini were decorated war veterans, leading parties heavily based on war veterans. But also the experience of the First World War had brutalized not just the people who fought in it, but in a way had brutalized the entire European system.
Population, yeah.
I always remember in 1912, I think it was, Friedrich Naumann wrote a book on the German political parties, in which he said about the anti-Semitic parties that one of the reasons they would never amount to anything serious, deeply unpleasant though they were, was that it was simply unimaginable for modern German bureaucrats should distinguish between German citizens on racial lines. This was unimaginable. Of course, it turned out to be imaginable, but really I think only because the First World War had intervened. We haven't had a First World War. We haven't had 10 million dead. And I think that partly for that, or very largely for that reason, unpleasant though they in some respects are, it would, I think, be really quite wrong to portray Alternative für Deutschland, for example, as a version of the Nazi Party, or the Front National.
Or the Freedom Party in Austria.
Yes.
They are right-wing, but in some aspects they are extreme right-wing, but they are not fascist.
No. And unlike, of course, some people in the former Soviet Union, some in the Balkans, possibly the Hungarians, in the rest of Europe, of course, the other thing is you have no territorial ambitions. Alternative für Deutschland is not trying to get back Königsberg or Schlesien. The Front National is not dreaming of annexing Belgium, although I suppose if Belgium collapses, they might take it anyway. That is important. And finally, geopolitically, there are, of course, post-imperial disputes within the former Soviet Union, which you could also say was true, in Central Europe in the 1930s. But the difference is, of course, that you said that Russia is a European country. Well, of course, so much of Western policy over the past generation has been precisely dedicated to saying that Russia is not a European country, that it's not part. That to be European, you have to be part of the EU and NATO. Russia isn't, therefore Russia is not European. Russia is a peripheral state, and these are peripheral issues as far as Europe is concerned. Germany was at the heart of Europe. Anything Germany did affected directly the security of everybody else.
So you mean we shouldn't worry too much about Putin trying to split up the EU by propaganda moves or by secret service moves or by...
The thing is, I worry deeply about the breakup of the EU, but blaming it on Putin is a diversion. Putin was not why a majority of British people, a small majority, but still, voted for Brexit. Putin is not why the Front National has been, this is to do with, one of the reasons why people try to blame Russia so much, I think, is that everything else is so difficult, so intractable. It's very difficult to come up with solutions, with answers. And therefore there is a certain natural tendency to find a scapegoat, because thinking about what to do on the subject of unemployment, about the future of work, about automation, about migration, about all these things, that is very, very difficult.
So you're implying that what we have now is a crisis of technological change, like before First World War?
Well, technological change and migration, of course, like in some respects before the First World War. But I would say that we are living in the era of Karl Lueger and Schörnerer, admittedly. Now, of course, Lueger and Schörnerer led to Hitler, but once again, with the First World War in the meantime. Now, if what we are really worrying about is the longer-term effects of automation, migration, and then looming behind that, of course, climate change. I mean, these are existential threats, but we do have more time, to think about what to do about them. Than they had. Yeah. But of course, I mean, if, for example, the Americans and Chinese stumble into a war in the South China Sea, then the world economy collapses in ruins, and then all bets are off.
How big are the chances of that with Trump in power? It's more than zero.
Oh, it's more than zero. I mean, it's difficult to put an exact figure on it, but I would still put it at 4 or 5 against, 5 to 1 against.
I see, yeah.